We're going to start this morning. My name is Mara Boone. I'm just your moderator MC for the morning session until lunch. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'm totally delighted to welcome Uncle Graham Dillon from the Kombumerri people, who are the traditional owners of this land. And he is, what I think is wonderful, he's an in-residence elder here at Griffith University. And we welcome a welcome to country. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mara. Now, I haven't got a long tirade to address you all because my part in the equation here is that much, so I like to think that I'm useful. And welcome to everyone here, but a special welcome to the Minister of the Environment. And about the only thing that we can pull rank on with the Minister is we are the closest environmentalists in this great south land of the Holy Spirit compared to everybody else. But having said that, friends, mankind is one. Nulli in Kayala, Balgal, Balgal and Nyunga, Dug Eyes. Dug Eyes is our friendly word for white people, non-Indigenous. The BC's not here, is that right, Mara? No. Oh, well, we want Professor Betts is here. He's two, I see. And welcome, Professor Betts. To the executive and presenters, most important, those people who will be presenting today in the interest of getting the knowledge factor out concerning Mother Earth and nursing, because my son once said, if we don't appreciate Mother Earth, she will turn on us one day, and that'll be blackfellas included. The whole lot, we'll all cop it. So it behoves us, friends, to respect Mother Earth. And Mother Earth has got nothing to do with politics because we're all human beings. A special welcome to you, Minister. Look forward to you hearing you later on. Now, friends, together with the First Nation reps, we extend a most cordial and warm welcome to Minister Dr. Stephen Miles. Can we give him a clap, please? And his support staff, who all come from Premier Palizak's government. And it's most important as we acknowledge the government of the day, because we're all here to make Queensland a better place for everybody, not just for today, but for successive follow-on generations. Because the Minister has taken the time to come and address the people, the presenters at Griffith University, may I offer you an honorary title, Minister. Sit where you are, don't move. We'd like, in my people's language, we'd like to call you Kamarun, K-A-M-A-R-U-N, Dugai. Now that simply means, Dugai means friendly, non-Indigenous people, but Kamarun's the most important word from our people's language. That means the boss, with respect. And after all, he's been entrusted to look after the environment through, or in concert with the Palaszczuk government, fighting the good fight. Minister, may I acknowledge your presence as the Premier's rep and indeed as a member of her cabinet. So as I said in our language, we'd like to afford you the title of Kamarun Dugai. You also are the direct representative as the carer, appointed carer of our environment. And the environment relates to every human being, not just in Queensland, but all over Australia, indeed the world, looking after Mother Earth. Life, friends, is generally all about partnerships. Now that's very important in this day and age. Aboriginals don't believe in the us and them. We believe that mankind is one, working together, making Australia a better place for all. And so that relates to the private, commercial, and the workforce in industry. Griffith University are, along with the government, to be commended in responding for and to their representations here, because it's all about the getting of knowledge, coming together and making this great state a better place to live in. Why are we doing this? Why are we going to the walking the extra mile, as it were, to try and understand the environment so that we can come to terms with it? Simply because there are generations to follow. If we said, no, I can't, no, it's just us, we're not going to worry about the rest of the world or the rest of the state, that would be a selfish way, because we've got generations to come following us, and it behoves us to consider them. Again, making Queensland a better place for all. So coming to the end of it, may the conference achieve the best outcomes, and again, thanks to the Queensland Government and in concert with Griffith University. And so we just wish you all the best, Minister, here today with your staff and, of course, Griffith University and their expertise. Thank you. One more thing. Minister, PBC, do you wish to make a presentation to the Minister today, Dr. Miles? Okay.
So thank you so much. What a wonderful welcome, really hitting the mark around our purpose and the particular place where we are. I'd like to start by just a little bit of housekeeping. So obviously we have some emergency exits here at the top. There's, facilities nearby. There is seriously an army of just wonderful volunteers that will guide us throughout the day. In acknowledging our sponsors, let me first reflect on how important it is for a community to have a very strong civil society and to have the environment represented in that really actively. And I remember when I moved to the Gold Coast 12 years ago and learned that Gecko had such a strong capacity and was so kind of ingrained in its people and its impact. And Lois is just such an incredible leader. Where is Lois? Yeah, like how lucky are we, right? So this conference comes at a time when there's just excitement in the air, energy in the air. It's so wonderful that Lois came together with Griffith, which really has a long-standing tradition on the environment. I remember hearing the story on how Griffith was the first university in Australia to actually have an environmental studies program. And then its capacity has shifted in so many ways. I'm totally thrilled. I'm what's called an industry fellow for the Center for Social Enterprise attached to the business school. And I can tell you through their activities, the thirst in the Brisbane and Gold Coast business community, Sunshine Coast, around really applying these things in business. So how wonderful that Gecko and Griffith have come together. I've just come back from Copenhagen at an event with 9 countries, and seriously, I just can't tell you how exciting the mood is out there. From Paris, we go in November to Morocco, and COP22 will happen in a place that is just opening a 500 megawatt solar thermal plant that is producing solar energy, get this, at under 3 cents a kilowatt hour. And in this conference, we had the Chinese, the Kenyans, the Chileans, the Mexicans. It's like a bidding war of how pension funds in Europe can fund these incredible new cities of the future with renewables. So we will find our way here in Queensland and here in the Gold Coast. We will lead there, and it's people like Lois and Griffith and others that are making this happen. We also have some wonderful sponsors that I want to acknowledge, of course. The Queensland Department of Environment and Heritage Protection, which has quite a bit of policy activity underway on climate change mitigation and adaptation, is helping this to happen, which is wonderful. Also would like to acknowledge Green Energy Company, formerly known as LEDtech, who are also sponsoring and actively participating in the conference. I think there's a slide that you can see just a huge group of organizations that have come together. So thank you, everyone, for making that happen. And it is now my great pleasure to invite Professor Martin Betts, who is the Prof of Engagement, known to many of you, I'm sure. Please, share your wisdom.
Thank you very much, Mara, and good morning all. Can I extend my own warm welcome to you all here to Griffith University's Gold Coast campus, for those of you that are visiting for the first time, and to this Climate Change for Good conference in 2016. I'm very pleased to represent the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Ian O'Connor, on this occasion. He's giving his full blessing to this conference. He would love to be here, but he's unable to be here on this occasion. Can I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, pay my respect to elders past, present and future, and extend that respect to all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I'd like to acknowledge the Honourable Dr. Stephen Miles, Minister for Environment and Heritage Protection and Minister for National Parks and the Great Barrier Reef, and also acknowledge Simon Richardson, the Mayor of Byron Bay Shire Council, Councillor Paul Bishop of Redland City Council, Professor Brendan Mackey, the Director of the Griffith Climate Change Response Programme, and also Larissa Baldwin, of the SEED National Co-Director of the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. But distinguished guests and colleagues and speakers at this conference, can I welcome you all? I know that with an audience like this, I'll be very much preaching to the converted, but to echo the words in introducing me, sustainability really is in Griffith University's DNA. It's how we were born. Some 41 years ago, you'd need to look no further than our current strategic plan to see the enduring commitment that we have to sustainability across the institution and how it underpins all that we seek to do. We've been committed to those principles, as Mara said, since the very first Australian Environmental Studies degree was established in this university more than 41 years ago. And this conference in many ways reflects that long-standing commitment and the responsibility that we as Griffith University accept as a leader in this field to better understand the complex, very complex climate change challenges that face us all, and how we should actively and collectively respond to them. If I look through the programme of your conference here over the next couple of days, I'm very struck by the interdisciplinary nature of the programme and the many different strands of scholarship and advocacy that it's bringing together, areas of business and investment, areas of policy and government relations, issues of urban studies, the issues of health and welfare in our communities, food security issues, conservation and sustainable tourism, a very diverse range of topics and schools of scholarly endeavour bound together by the issues of making adequate responses to climate change. And fittingly, our Climate Change Response Programme promotes a multidisciplinary approach to climate change research, inclusive of those different strands of environmental, social, economic and governance dimensions. Our research capacity at this university in this space is significant and growing, and we were delighted in 2014 that the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility here at Griffith, hosted here at Griffith, was awarded a further $8.9 million from the federal government for phase 2 of its research programme. And this facility works with different national science agencies, with a variety of academics around the country and around the world, together with state and local governments, community organisations and businesses, to develop a framework to help local governments make better decisions about risks from rising sea levels and more intense storm surges. And goodness knows we've seen enough of that even just recently to recognise how it continues and grows to be a problem confronting us. We're delighted that one of the other symptoms or legacies of our foundation some 41 years ago, the Australian Rivers Institute, we know it as ARI, is home to more than 120 scientists and research students. It's the largest research concentration of university-based water researchers anywhere in Australia, and ARI plays a very leading role in managing water resources with a focus on freshwater, estuarine and urban water. And we recognise that research in these areas is vitally important, but equally it's important to see how it informs manageable community engagement, and I think that's what's so special about this conference. In the work of Griffith, we have a Centre for Coastal Management that runs award-winning beach care and coast ed programmes, which have involved more than 35,000 school students to date, and a whole variety of very hands-on learning activities. We're not interested in just writing papers for ourselves to read, we're interested in getting that work with the young people of our communities, informing their thinking for the future. And at our Nathan campus, the Eco Centre that's been established for some years now has seen more than 55,000 school students through the doors of the Toohey Forest Environmental Education Centre through a long-standing partnership with the Queensland Department of Education and Training. So Griffith University is looking to play its part in ensuring that the next generation is environmentally literate. And what an incredibly important mission that is, and I thank you for all of your dedication and commitment to that. So between conference sessions over the next couple of days, while you're not busy networking, and I'm sure there'll be lots of that going on, I encourage you to search for some of the great sustainability evidence that we have around us through some apps that have been created by Griffith research students and researchers and alumni. So Grows at Griffith is an app that Catherine Pickering here in the audience has been leading the development of. It provides access to a searchable database of 300 plants found on our 5 campuses. And the Coastal Life app, jointly developed with the Queensland Museum, offers a portable tool for high school students and undergraduates, as well as interested naturalists and beach walkers, to have access to more than 540 species of marine plants and invertebrate animals from coastal habitats across the southeast Queensland region, packed with useful information. So I'm sure the politicians and campaigners here today especially understand the vital link between useful information and action. So let's get to the action. And on that note, we have a real privilege at the start of this conference, and a real privilege for me, to be able to introduce the Honourable Dr. Stephen Miles, the Minister for Environment and Heritage Protection, the Minister for National Parks and the Great Barrier Reef, to provide an opening address to inspire us all into the conference. Can I thank you all for the commitment you have made as speakers and delegates to this conference. I trust you'll enjoy the coming 2 days very much, but for now, will you all please join with me in welcoming Minister Miles to the lectern.
Thank you, Martin. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me too acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we gather on, and thank you, Uncle Graham, for that very warm welcome. And I will wear the title of Cameron Dugai with great honour, although I'm not sure the title of the boss is entirely appropriate. I spend a lot of time telling people that you'd be surprised what the Environment Minister doesn't get to do. So sadly not the boss in a lot of ways, but thank you so much for welcoming me here. I won't repeat the acknowledgements that Martin has been through, but I will particularly acknowledge Lois and the members and executive of Gecko, who do just such a wonderful job of keeping these important issues on the agenda here on the Gold Coast. I also want to acknowledge Mara. Mara is climate change famous. She's a climate change rock star, and as you could tell from her introduction, she's climate change famous on a global scale. So we're very honoured to have her here on the Gold Coast. And I also want to acknowledge Leslie Sheriffs. Where's Leslie? Leslie's here. Leslie's my roaming advisor-in-chief, so it's great to have her here. Thank you all for the opportunity to speak to you today. Let me again congratulate Gecko for bringing us all together to share ideas and information that will help determine our response to climate change. Lois has been talking to me about this conference for a long time, I think. I had been elected barely hours when Lois wanted to talk about organising this conference, and so it's lovely to finally be here with you all for it. On the 17th of June, the World Meteorological Organisation announced that May 2016 was the 13th consecutive month in which global average temperature records were broken. This is the longest such run of record-breaking temperatures literally since records began. Indeed, 14 of the 15 hottest years on record have occurred since 2001. The fact that our Earth is getting warmer is no longer a point of debate. At the 21st United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change conference in Paris, the global community agreed to keep global temperature increases to well below 2 degrees Celsius. To meet this goal, global greenhouse gas emissions must reach net zero in the second half of this century and as close to the year 2050 as possible. Countries around the world are already acting to reduce emissions. To date, 188 nations, accounting for almost 99% of global greenhouse gas emissions, have submitted their post-2020 reduction targets. Climate change is a global problem, but it has very real local consequences. Our precious Great Barrier Reef is in the grip of a severe coral bleaching event, which has affected 93% of this marine icon in only a few short months. And this is me with my boy Sam. He's 8, and that was his second trip to the reef, and it was to inspect the bleaching event, sadly. Commonwealth scientists recently confirmed that this extreme coral bleaching was only possible because of global warming, and the El Niño weather event merely acted as a trigger. On this election eve, we know our choices tomorrow will have a big impact on how Australia addresses its climate change obligations. So, sorry for getting a bit political here. I am a politician, and it's the day before an election. But let's be clear about this. The Turnbull government has done shockingly little to address climate change or its effects on the Great Barrier Reef. You might have seen Turnbull and Hunt claiming they had committed new money for the reef during this election campaign and to address climate change. But their announcement of $1 billion for the reef over 10 years is not new money. It's money they're stealing from the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. They are rebadging that money to create a loans program, which is already available through the CEFC as a loans program. It strikes me that, first of all, Greg Hunt believes that you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions without actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now he says you can spend $1 billion on the reef without spending a single dollar on the reef. This is pretty tricky policy, and it's just designed to mislead voters. Of course, I support the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Let's not forget it was a Labor program that Greg Hunt voted twice to abolish. I support it, but it's not a magic pudding. They've offered no new money for improving the quality of water flowing into the reef or for tackling climate change. Here in Queensland, we know what happens when you have an LNP government that tries to bury climate change. 3 years of inaction, worse still, 3 years of climate denial, and Queensland is on track to massively increase its emissions rather than decrease them. We recently released our carbon pollution projections for Queensland. We often call them the business as usual modelling. It showed us that if we do nothing, Queensland's greenhouse gas emissions, the primary cause of global warming, could rise by a staggering 35% to 2030. This will have major consequences for Queenslanders. Preliminary analysis by our science department says that if carbon pollution continues on this path, by 2030, southeast Queensland, including the Gold Coast, faces temperature increases of 1.3 degrees Celsius by 2030, meaning more hotter days throughout the year. Overall, the average total yearly rainfall is expected to decrease by around 5%. But when rain does fall, it will be more intense, bursts like what we've recently experienced over the last few weeks. This means greater risks of flash flooding, erosion and damage to property and public infrastructure. At the same time as the temperature increases, so too does evaporation, resulting in reduced soil moisture and available surface water. This reduces the water available for growing food, for human settlements and the natural environment. It will affect our agricultural productivity, how we build and maintain our infrastructure, and the types of plants and animals we find in our local environment. In Queensland, the Palaszczuk government was elected with a mandate to revitalise the state's climate change agenda. We are well underway to ensure Queensland plays its part in the global effort to limit warming to well below 2 degrees. Doing so is critical for the long-term viability of our economy, our communities, and our industries. It may be a challenge, but it also represents an opportunity to grow our renewables industry and to create new clean energy jobs. The big question for me and for our government is, in 10 years' time, when kids like my son Sam finish school, what kind of jobs will they be looking for? Change is happening now. Smart people and smart governments will identify the trends and anticipate them. Technology is a big driver of this, and we've already seen a shift to a knowledge economy, that is an economy geared towards growth in high technology industries, more highly skilled labour, and the productivity gains that come with that. Another trend is technology leapfrogging. So we're seeing in many parts of the developing world, renewables technology leapfrogging the old grid fossil fuel technology that powers our cities. Another megatrend, not so often discussed, although I think it's incredibly important, is the decoupling of economic growth from growth in carbon emissions. We've long been told that a growing economy is by necessity more carbon intensive, that economic growth cannot be achieved without emissions growth. That's why the short-sighted Newman government had Queensland on that horrible pathway for increased emissions. But in recent years, this notion has been debunked. The decoupling of economic growth and pollution growth has been achieved in many places. So it's a shame we went 3 years here in Queensland without a plan for how Queensland can grow jobs while cutting pollution. It's even more shameful that the federal government continues to refuse to present any meaningful policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and create clean energy jobs. Our government will develop a strategy to manage the transition to a low-carbon future, because it's no longer a question of will we transition to a clean energy future. It's now a question of when and how. Modelling by the Climate Institute has found that generating enough renewable energy to meet a 20% of Australia's electricity target will result in $19 billion of investment nationwide and create more than 31,000 full-time jobs by 2030. At least 6,000 of those jobs will be in Queensland, but that's a conservative estimate. If the target were raised to 50%, as has been proposed by Labor and Bill Shorten, the investment would surge to about $50 billion, creating 17,000 jobs in Queensland alone. The waste sector is another area we are seeing a surge in jobs growth. One person's trash is another person's treasure, or I like to say, one person's trash is another person's highly skilled, secure, clean energy job. Last year, the Premier declared her commitment to a biofutures agenda, and in particular, the creation of a biofuels industry in Queensland. A great example of this is Northern Oil, a company which recently made a commitment to invest in establishing a pilot plant for an entirely new biofuel refinery near Gladstone. The refinery will be a next-generation biofuel producer with the capacity to use an exceptionally wide range of feedstocks, everything from tyres and plastics through to green waste and bioenergy crops. We want to attract more of the investment needed to support these new industries to grow and flourish. Economic growth in the future will be about clean growth. Our task as the Queensland Government is to make sure our fair share of the jobs and industries of the future are built here in Queensland for our children. Queensland was once a national leader when it came to taking action on climate change. It's time to get Queensland back on track, ready to face the challenges and embrace the opportunities of the future. The recent state budget delivered a range of initiatives that are vital to protecting our environment and delivering better outcomes for all Queenslanders. The Queensland Government has committed a further $6.8 million for strategies to help get our state climate ready and transition to the new economy. This is in addition to the $12 million we've already provided to the Q Coast 2100 program, which helps local government to get ready for coastal hazards that will be exacerbated by climate change. We will also continue to protect land with high conservation values through increased funding. This includes $2.8 million for the Nature Assist program and $5 million to acquire publicly owned land for the protected area estate for new national parks. Our park acquisition program is informed by world-leading science. The science maps the most climate-resilient land that will be the most valuable refuges for native wildlife in a hotter world. Just last week, significant areas were added to the national and regional parks of Queensland, bringing the total protected area to more than 13.5 million hectares, almost 8% of the state. The Queensland Government is now well on the way to meeting our commitment to having 17% of Queensland managed as protected areas. We know climate change will place increasing pressure on our environment, affecting plants, animals and ecosystems. By creating more national parks and developing strategies to manage and maintain healthy habitats, we will help build resilience to climate change. Through acquisitions, we are ensuring high conservation values are protected and maintained for future generations to explore, enjoy and fall in love with. This major boost to the protected area estate includes the Queensland Government's recent $7 million purchase of the Springvale Station, situated south of Cooktown. This badly degraded grazing land on one property, this one property is responsible for 40% of the sediment that flows from gully erosion into the Normanby River. That's 500,000 tonnes of sediment every year. Runoff from land carries sediment from the Normanby Basin to the outer reef, where it blocks light, smothers marine organisms, and reduces coral and seagrass growth. We need to make sure the reef has the best chance to recover from this event by making sure water flowing from the catchments is as clean as possible. And a heads up, also in the budget, get ready for our new $12 million Community Sustainability Action Grants scheme, and I hope to see Gecko succeed in one of those grant rounds. It's $12 million for heritage, climate and conservation projects directed at local sustainability efforts. In May this year, the Queensland Government launched a public conversation on how the state can reduce its carbon pollution. We released a discussion paper, Advancing Climate Action, Making the Transition to a Low Carbon Future. Consultation closes on 5 August, so if you haven't already done so, please take a look at the discussion paper and get involved on the Get Involved website. I need you to have your say in developing the right strategies to achieve a low carbon future. So in closing, I want to once again congratulate Gecko and Griffith University for their foresight in establishing this conference. Thank you so much for bringing us all together. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. We're going to take the liberty of, the Minister has agreed to answer a few questions before he goes, and we literally have precious moments. We're already a little bit behind time. I know there are people champing at the bit to talk about Adani and why it was approved and coal and why, how come we can't get rid of it. You can ask those questions. They're asked all the time. But these are precious moments, and we're about to revisit the strategy, the investment. Who would like to ask the 1 or 2 questions that, please, and if you could introduce yourself and wait for the mic because this is being streamed. If we could give the mic to this woman, please, and let us know who you are. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Debbie Firestone. I'm the Sustainability Program Leader from Tweechar Council on the other side of the border. I'm very interested in Queensland Government's plans to introduce a waste levy.
Very good. Is this working? Look, I talked a bit about waste, and there is no doubt that the Queensland waste and recycling industry is far behind other states because the Newman government abolished the waste levy. We know that the 12 months that, I'm looking at Leslie, 12 months that the waste levy was in place, we were driving a shift in waste from landfill to recycling. We were driving investment from industry. When it was abolished, that all turned around, and as you well know, trucks and trains of waste started coming from the Tweed and much further south to be dumped here in Queensland. So that's irresponsible policy with a terrible outcome. We were elected with a commitment, though, that we would not introduce any new taxes and charges, and that includes a potential waste levy. So that's not on the table, certainly not for this term of government. So the task set for me is how do you achieve some of those positive outcomes while constrained by that political commitment. So the areas that we are focusing on in the short term are potential landfill bans, so banning certain types of waste from the landfill stream, especially that waste that is most dangerous and also most useful for refineries like Southern Oil, so things like tyres, the standout there. We're also going to re-regulate tyre stockpiles. You won't believe this, but the previous government took away the requirement for you to need a permit to stockpile hundreds of thousands of tyres. So what we have is it's cheaper to stockpile them than to even put them in landfill. So you have people create these stockpiles, fill them with dangerous, explosive tyres, lease the sheds, and then once they've filled them, they just walk away and leave the landlord with this giant pile of tyres. So reintroducing regulation for that, we're well on the path of bringing back a cash for containers scheme, as I know New South Wales is too, and also where they're a bit ahead of us on cash for cans, we're a bit ahead of them on banning plastic bags, but hope to do both together. So what I've tried to do is pull together a range of waste and recycling initiatives that we can do now, with the acceptance that long term we need an economy-wide measure to drive change.
That was a fantastic response. If there's another very fast question, and we guarantee a very fast answer, and please introduce yourself. Thank you so much. Use the microphone. Thanks. This is being streamed.
Stephen Gratian, President of Save Our Spit Alliance. My question is, I believe an invitation has been extended to the Minister to dive our wonderful seaway and Wavebreak Island to look firsthand at the over 500 species of marine life and the environment that we currently have in the Broadwater. Are you able to take up that offer, and if so, when will you be doing your dive?
What a great short question.
Yes, it had been it had briefly been my intention to do that later today while I'm on the Gold Coast, and I decided it was too cold. But having said that, they've found another way to make me swim today, so it's still going to be very cold. But just certainly next time we're down here, I would love to. I got to tell you that for all of the times I've dived the Great Barrier Reef, the best dive I've ever done is just north of North Stradbroke Island. So if any of you have not snorkeled or scubaed the waterways within half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour of here, you're really missing out on something. It's quite amazing.
5 minutes from here in the seaway.
And you can do a couple more. Okay, we're going to go back on the program, but we're all good with that, aren't we? Are we okay? Yeah, we're okay, because this is special. Any other questions? These are good questions. Please.
Kara Sash, being an early uptaker of solar PV on the roof and just recently going over to battery storage, I understand that it was actually mentioned once that from the Palaszczuk government of the 60-cent feed-in tariff is pretty well non-viable, that as a way of helping those people is to actually subsidise batteries, which would probably save an awful lot more electricity if that was done. Have you got any feelings on that?
So it's one of the options on the table for our renewable energy panel. So they've been tasked with the job of working out if we and how we can achieve a 50% renewable energy target, which will require finding new ways to drive not just large scale but also rooftop take up. So that's finding ways for example, landlords and renters to share the benefit of of solar. And one of the options for them is potentially the government could buy out the existing generous feed-in tariff with subsidised battery storage. So that's certainly something they're looking at. They've modelled the numbers, and there is I think a way that could be done. It's kind of a long way from being ready for a decision, though. But I mean, the great news is, yes, we'll never see 44 or 52 cents feed-in tariffs, but you don't need them anymore either. The technology price curve has moved in such a way that people getting it now, even with the 6 or 8 cent feed-in tariff, are actually getting a better economic deal than people who bought in the early days. So.
Very good. And I think we have time for one more question, so please, if we could pass the mic to the center here. Apologies for everyone else. It's going to be a very interactive day, so I promise you'll have a chance to, come back if we didn't get to you in this session.
G'day. My name's Sheila Davis, and thank you very much for being here, Minister. I'm sure you're aware that the South East Queensland Regional Plan is currently being reviewed by your government in order to accommodate more people here in South East Queensland than previously projected. My concern is because South East Queensland is such a high biodiversity area, both our South East Queensland Regional Nature Conservation Strategy and the Gold Coast Nature Conservation Strategy have acknowledged how special this area is. Yet the Gold Coast is supposed to be taking 600,000 more people in the next 20 years. Don't see how we're going to accommodate these number of people, but at the same time as protecting this biodiversity. In fact, we're building a city centre in the middle of koala habitat right now in Kombumerri. So I'm wondering, to what extent is your department involved, and what say you might have over all of this?
They are very closely involved.
Pardon? Can you hold your mic up a little?
They are very closely involved. The work is led by the Deputy Premier. I sit on the committee with the South East Queensland mayors and Jackie. The EHP is closely involved. Like and you won't find, I don't think, a more environmentally conscious planning minister anywhere than Jackie Trad. She was our environment spokesperson in opposition, and so has a real passion and interest in this. I think the purpose of the process is to answer that question. How can we? There is not. We are fortunate to all live in an amazing part of the world that more people want to live in, and we need to work out how we protect vital ecosystems, how we protect parks in locations close to where all of these people are living and will want to enjoy them while also accommodating more people, and that's what the process is all about.
Okay, wonderful. On behalf of everyone, can I just say that it's rare to actually have a genuine advocate as a minister, and one who seems to warmly connect to this issue through his kids, his ideas. We're very grateful. And you have a very strong community of like-minded people here on the Gold Coast who love our natural world. So please help us to work for it. Thank you so much. Okay, it is now, and we're okay running behind track because unfortunately one of our other speakers has been unable to make it just now. She might, but it's actually good news because we are therefore tacking on time, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Brendan Mackey. Brendan leads the climate response program here at Griffith, but really because his research connects biodiversity, placemaking, in the context of a changing climate, it's just extremely relevant. And he tells me he was involved back in the first Earth Summit, back in the days when we developed the Earth Charter. Some of you may be familiar with that. He was actually instrumental in writing that So it's just incredible that in this corner of Queensland we have such influence and leverage, and we look to Brendan for a very important scene-setting talk. So please join us.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for coming and for having me. And I hope if I push this arrow, the thing will proceed. Okay, that's great. Well, I've called my presentation Where the Rubber Hits the Road, Local Action the Key to Implementing the Paris Agreement. So we all heard about the Paris Agreement. That was the new climate change treaty that was agreed to at the Paris conference last year. I've asked for this to be dragged out. Because there's a photo on it I want you all to see. Of beautiful culture dancing on Tanna Island in Vanuatu up here. And I'll talk about that shortly. So, you know, these treaties are signed by governments. Our government signed it. And I'm often asked, well, what does this mean for everyone else? And that's really what I want to explain to you this morning. And our minister, I think, did a very good job of explaining that, you know, the science is now beyond dispute. We're getting new record temperatures set every month, every season, every year, everywhere, unfortunately. And that's just some statistics from NASA's latest press release, just reinforcing that. And at the bottom it says there's a 99% probability that 2016 as a whole will set a whole new heat record. Again, I don't want to dwell on this. I just want to make one point, and it's a sobering point. We often talk about wanting the problems of global warming, but we never really think about how bad it could get. Well, this is kind of how bad it could get, and this is from a guy called Meinhausen, who's one of the key IPCC global modelers, and the bottom axis is time in years, 1900 to the year 2300. The year 2300 sounds a bit like science fiction, but it will happen one day. And the vertical axis is the increase in average global temperatures above pre-industrial, and the dotted line is this 2-degree guardrail, which we're on track to hit by about 2050. This is a business as usual scenario if we fail to mitigate. So what this graph is illustrating is that we're not going to run out of fossil fuel. There's hundreds of years of fossil fuel, and there's a lot more global warming to happen. Certainly by worst case scenarios is terrifying to think about the consequences of that. So this kind of information has proven to be very influential. So the Paris Agreement, it's good news. It's good news for all. It's good news that all major political parties in Australia support the Paris Agreement. I'm arguing we can now stop arguing about whether it's happening or not or why, and get on with the necessary mitigation and adaptation action. So the only political argument now should be about which are the most cost-effective policies and how to prioritise and finance the necessary climate actions. But I want to draw your attention to this really key point. The Article 2 of the Paris Agreement sets the long-term mitigation goal as holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial level, and to pursue efforts to pursue the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So the target is fuzzy. It's between 1.5 degree and 2 degrees. It doesn't sound like much. You know, we hear this a lot. Well, in fact, I think I heard Barnaby Joyce say it recently. 2 degrees more warming in northern rivers, or would be welcome, right? Well, of course, it's a statistic. If you think about it, the average planetary surface temperature is only about 14 degrees Celsius, right? So an increase of 2 degrees is actually an increase of 15%. So let's compare that to a human body. A healthy human body's temperature is 37 degrees Celsius, right? So if your body temperature increases by 15%, it's going to be 42.6 degrees. Well, that's a life-threatening fever. In fact, there's a medical condition called hyperprexia, which is a body temperature greater than 41.5 degrees is considered a medical emergency. Okay? So going above 1.5 to 2 degrees risks sending us into planetary hyperprexia. So the Paris Agreement is really significant because the world community has actually agreed we should try and avoid that. But what does that mean practically? Practically, what does it mean to say we want to limit warming to 2 degrees? Well, there's 2 points to make here about the Paris Agreement. They use a term in it called non-state actors. Well, that's you. You and me as a non-state actor. Minister Stevens was a non-state actor. Queensland State Government's not a state party. It's not a sovereign state. Okay? Governments at all levels are non-state actors. Local governments, businesses, communities, families and individuals. If you think about it, implementing the Paris Agreement, limiting warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees cannot be done by governments. Okay? It actually has to be done by everyone else, all the non-state actors. So I want to talk a bit about what the role of governments and non-state actors and you and I are in terms of the 2 things we have to do to deal with climate change. One is mitigation, reduce greenhouse gas emissions to meet that global warming target, and the other is adaptation, which is modify what we do or change what we do to minimise the impact or even take advantage of a rapidly changing climate. So in terms of mitigation, there's the key responsibilities of national government. What are they? Well, look, the science is really clear on this. To limit global warming to less than 2 degrees, greenhouse gas emissions have to be reduced to zero by no later than about mid the second half of this century, by about 2080. Let me say that again. To limit global warming to below 2 degrees, greenhouse gas emissions, human greenhouse gas emissions, have to be reduced to zero. So the policy statements you hear don't actually really grasp that fact or reflect that fact, right? So the Turnbull government's 2030 target is an emission cut of 26 to 28% on 2005 levels. Labor's election pledge is better, it's 45%, and the Greens is better still, 63 to 82%. But that's what happens by 2030. That's not what happens after 2030. Well, the graph's got to look something like this. So the bottom axis is time, 2005 to 2080, and the vertical axis is Australia's greenhouse gas emissions in thousands of tonnes of CO2 equivalent. So in order to, everyone in the world has to follow a curve like this. Our emissions have to reduce each year at some rate, and by around 2080 have to be zero. So any of you who remember your high school calculus know that the area under the curve is a quantity. That's our budget. Each country has to say not what its 2030 target is, but when its emissions are going to be zero, right? And that gives you a budget. If you think of it, you can call it a cap. Now, the Climate Change Commission did calculate what our cap would be for 2015 to 2050, not to zero emissions, and that's 10,000 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. That's not actually our total budget, that's just our budget to 2050. The Paris Agreement requires each government to declare what its global budget to zero is going to be. Its total permissible emissions, right, on the path to zero emissions. And we haven't done that yet. So the only policy tool I can think of that will deliver that is I mean, there's really 2 approaches here, a carbon tax or a cap and trade scheme. And and both have their advantages and disadvantages, but the advantage of a cap and trade scheme with an annually decreasing cap is certainly one way of guaranteeing that we can achieve that curve. But the challenge is huge. It's absolutely huge when you look at the total task ahead to 2080, not just a percentage target by 2030. So governments have a really important role to play. National governments and state governments have a really important role to play in terms of levelling the playing field. And there's a couple of things they can do. One of the more significant mitigation policy reforms by federal and state governments is to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. Globally, it's been estimated they stand at $5.13 trillion. Right? And Australia's rate of fossil fuel subsidies is estimated at $1,700 per person, or about $41.6 billion per year is what we're publicly subsidising fossil fuel emissions. So if we were to remove those fossil fuel subsidies and set really high renewable energy targets, it would have a transformative effect for others to take action. Local governments have a critical role to play, and we know that at a formal government level, they're really leading the way towards zero emissions. A number of local government authorities, including the National Local Government Association, are now making really strong zero emission targets. And this is, again, a really exciting development. Local governments are proving to be far more progressive than states, who in turn are proving to be far more progressive than federal. But as we've heard and had a brief reference to during the discussion and from the Minister, at the family and individual level, we are facing nothing short of a domestic energy revolution, advances in the efficiency of solar panels and the longevity of solar panels. Remember, when you buy solar panels, buy good ones that last for 30 years, not cheap ones that last for 5 years. Plus technological revolutions in battery storage, plus smart inverters that match supply and demand, plus affordable electric cars, the one on the left, not the one on the right. I'd love the one on the right. Really equals a domestic energy revolution, and I think we're all, are aware of that or part of that. And it's not hard to imagine that in 5 years' time this will be the norm, or certainly very, very common everywhere, including here on the Gold Coast. We will all have solar panels, batteries, smart inverters, and more of us electric cars, and we'll be off the grid. Praise the Lord. Adaptation is something that we have to really start thinking about now very seriously. I was going to say even if, when we succeed in reducing our fossil fuel emissions to zero, and when we succeed in stabilising global warming to well below 2 degrees, right, we will still have a disrupted climate system for millennia. And that's because there are lags in the Earth's system. A lot of it's to do with the fact that most of the energy, extra energy, being kept in the Earth is going to heat the oceans, and that's discharged over hundreds of years, which causes further disruption to the weather patterns. So this idea of having a climatic norm that we can design to or plan to, we actually have to throw that out the window, because we're going to be facing, whilst we're going to be capping global warming, the climate will not be settling down for a very, very long time. So we're going to have to learn how to mainstream adaptation into everything that we do. And it's difficult because climate impacts get complex quickly, and I'll take one that we're all familiar with, this concept of coastal inundation and erosion. This is not the influence of one climatic factor or one process. It's a ensemble of interacting factors. We know we have rising sea levels. We know that with changing winds we'll have increased or changing wave heights and wave energy. We know we're going to see increasing frequency and or intensity of extreme weather events, tropical storms, east coast winter lows. We know we get sediment and nutrients from runoffs, which affect the resilience of our coastal ecosystems. And there's also going to be changes to ocean currents, which affect everything. And it's the interaction of all of them, plus the infrastructure we choose and how we choose to build it in the coastal zone, that determine the actual impacts. So our adaptation has to take into account all of these factors. But really, the good news is that good planning is the key to successful adaptation. And we actually have a very good example of it I used to use on the Gold Coast, which we're not used to thinking about. But you may have noticed that there's no vertical concrete seawall on the Gold Coast, right? And that's actually unusual. Half of Europe is covered in a concrete seawall, right? Japan is just building a new 250-metre concrete seawall that will be in a lot of it 17 metres high. You know, for most of the world, when coastal infrastructure is threatened, they build a vertical concrete seawall. Here on the Gold Coast, we use a loose rubble A-line, but the main defence is actually beach replenishment, right? It's a soft engineering approach. Sand's pumped out from the estuaries. The beach front is kept very wide, and that absorbs the wave energy from big storm events when we get them. Bad planning is asking for trouble. That's on Melee Beach in Vanuatu near Port Vila. It's a new Chinese 5-star resort hotel that's going right on top of what's been mapped as the most vulnerable location in Vanuatu for all geohazards. So again, local governments are critical here because they play such an important role in planning. And a lot about adapting to the unavoidable impacts of a rapidly changing climate. A lot of that really comes down to good planning at the local government level. As is good design. And that's why I wanted to not just show off our beautiful poster that Amira put together, but this beautiful custom dancing that was held on the Tanna Island at the south end of the Vanuatu archipelago. And this was to celebrate, it was a community event to celebrate something that happened post-Cyclone Pam. So we all heard about Tropical Cyclone Pam. It was a Category 5 cyclone that ripped through Vanuatu and basically destroyed, really did a lot of damage on Tanna Island. Well, post-Tanna Island, the provincial government and the local government, which is a council of tribal chiefs, decided, well, we're going to have to face the fact that we're going to be, this is not a one-off, we're facing a new climatic regime. We have to start thinking about how can we rebuild a resilient Tanna Island? You know, how can we have better planning and better design of our homes and our villages and our infrastructure so that it's resilient to these changing climatic conditions. And so this was a big ceremony. There were 700 custom dances which were to celebrate the start of this project. So as part of this revitalisation for Tanna post-Cyclone Pam, and it was actually through a charitable trust donation, it's funded construction of Category 5 rated safe houses, community buildings, and that come with a solar mini-powered system in 14 villages. So there are now 14 villages which have been set up as like a model cluster of villages where they have for the first time community buildings which are Category 5 cyclone rated, so they can double as a safe house during a tropical storm, as well as providing all these services they haven't had before. One's being used as a schoolhouse, one as a medical centre, etc. And they come with these solar mini power systems with smart converters, which Global Green, who are sponsoring this conference, provided. Actually, they donated them all to all 14 villages. These villages never had electricity before, didn't have diesel generators off the grid, so they've never had power, and these are the first modern structures any of these villages have ever had. So again, good design, adaptation is all about good design. It's not about expensive design, but it's certainly about good design, and it is about leapfrogging. It's about not having a diesel generator, not being connected to a grid from a coal-powered fire station, but about making use of smart green technology. So, what's the way forward? Well, as I said, the governments have signed the Paris Agreement, but they really can't implement it. They can promote its, advance its implementation through appropriate policy, or the lack of it, they can put up barriers if they want to as implementation, but the actual work of reducing emissions and the actual work of adapting is done by all these other non-state actors. It's done by you, it's done by me, it's done by businesses, it's done by local governments, it's done by state governments. So at the moment, this is the current situation. Climate change has been, and still is, at this election, federal election, a political football, okay? It's just one of a whole bunch of problems that governments are trying to juggle with, and that they kick around at election time to try and get votes in certain electorates, or that they ignore at election time because it's not going to get them any votes. It's kind of the current situation. Labor and Liberal are really not talking much about climate change or environmental issues. Don't start me on the lack of forest protection policy in the current election. But we have to change this. We have to stop climate change being seen and used as a political football. This is a matter of national security. It's a matter of global security. National security, in the conventional sense, is one area where there's bipartisan support. The Greens have a defence policy, right? The Greens don't have a policy which says we'll no longer have an air force, right? We'll no longer have an army or a navy, right? There's complete support, cross-party support for having a defence force because it's a matter of national security. So we need to elevate climate change, mitigation, adaptation to that level. So, where we need to be, people power policy push, I like to call it, We need to be where all of us non-state actors, create the demand and the political will for supportive policies and programs from all parties for climate change action. And thinking about it, I think that's what we mean by democracy. Thank you.
That was a fantastic overview, Brendan. I just wanted to ask, I'm confirming that Larissa Baldwin has not been able to get here in time, which is such a shame. So just for a few minutes, can I ask, please raise your hands, who is younger than 25? Obviously not me. Oh, some wonderful hands. So, Larissa is with the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. We think it's really important to have a sense of youth in this conversation. I welcome anyone who's young who's here, if you'd like to offer just a brief reflection on why for your generation this issue is so critical. Would anyone like to make a comment from that perspective? Oh, we'll do that for sure, yeah. I'm sorry, you are very good looking, but definitely not. We're gonna actually move then into a bit of a Q&A, and I might open with a question for Brendan first, and maybe we'll just do it both up here, or just give Brendan one of the mics. That would be great. Thank you. So you made a comment going straight to battery and off with the grid. I don't know, Simon Richardson is here yet. Hello, welcome. So I'm a non-executive director on the board of Enova Community Energy, which is a wonderful new crowd-funded, community-owned energy retailer in the Northern Rivers region. And we have a fantastic crew that's rapidly taking on customers. And it's one of our reflections that the grid actually is a really important asset for Australia for social inclusion. There are many disadvantaged people in our communities that can't afford solar. And so for them to have access to energy and even renewable energy, we require grid. The other lens that I bring to this issue, which is a big challenge, as chair of the Gold Coast Waterways Authority Board, and Leslie Sheriff's here also as a director, we have an extremely energy consuming system and that sand bypass system. It's a huge amount of energy required for the sand to replenish the beaches. We would love to power that with renewable energy, but the rules mean we'd need a microgrid, really, on the spit to make that happen, because you have to generate close to where you actually, connect to the meter in order to have reduced tariffs. It's a complex kind of economic argument, but I'm just wondering, is there a vision for a blended grid? Because if we go to the straight off the grid thing, not so sure.
I wasn't suggesting that we don't need a grid. I was just saying that individuals will be able to be off the grid, in that they can be self-powered. But that doesn't mean you'll be disconnected from the grid necessarily. But I haven't finished my answer. Of course, it was a very long question, and it warrants a very long answer. But we need a new grid. We need a smart grid. We don't have a smart grid, so that's the challenge, and that's where the investment's needed and where the R&D's needed.
Very good, excellent. Okay, I think hands are coming up. Liesl, please, and if we could pass the mic and introduce yourself, and let's have a chat.
But can I say, for developing countries, this is a huge issue, because countries like Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu are under enormous pressure from companies who are advising their national governments to put in fossil fueled powered generators and conventional grids, when 80% of their people live in villages that will never be connected to the grid, when they can be like these villages today with all the power they need. So that's
very good point. Very good
that's
point.
The issue.
Okay, please.
Hi there, Lisa Coulter. So I'm a PhD candidate with Griffith University at the moment, but I had been the communication manager with NCARF and CSIRO's climate adaptation. So I come at this from a couple of perspectives. My question to you is, do you think that the focus of this 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees limit that we've all agreed that now we're trying to reach is a bit of a distraction, and that people will believe that that will then mean that we're going to get there, which is really up for grabs, and that it'll mean that they're not going to have to deal with significant climate change?
Okay, well, there's two parts to that. The point I was trying to make, that in using this statistic of 1.5 or 2 degrees, it's not immediately apparent what that means in terms of the amount of fossil fuel emissions, the amount of CO2. It actually equates to a specific quantity of carbon dioxide, right? So people need to understand that the mitigation challenge is, real and material and specific. Sure, there's a big communication challenge in saying, if we achieve this 2 degree target, it will mean we're not going to have any more climate problems. That's just not true.
But that's not being communicated, I think, in the way the discourse goes.
We're still, in this transition zone from having this ridiculous argument about whether climate change is happening or not, and if so, why. Okay, so it's been very hard to communicate, what are kind of these subtleties. I mean, it's not subtle, but subtle in terms of, it's a nuanced understanding of what's going on. It's very hard to do that when you're still having this really harsh, irrational debate with flat Earth thinking. So if we can get beyond the flat Earth thinking, we can start having the more kind of intelligent, informed, discussions we need to have about what's really going to be happening.
Thanks for that.
There are still people who believe that the Earth's flat. Okay, we just don't spend much time involving them in public policy.
And some of those people may be running North America soon, so, they're like a big, big weird. We have time, I'm told, for one more question. Gentleman here in the middle, got his hand up first. If we can get a mic. Thank you.
Hi. I'd just like to make the point that global warming could quite possibly be a symptom of a greater malice, which is our financial system, which is really designed around competition. Because the only way that we're going to get the temperatures down is for a global cooperation between all countries with the expressed desire to do so. And when you've got a competitive system like we have, that will never happen. So it's not the warming that's our issue, it's our financial system. It's the competition behind it.
So thank you
That's
very much.
where the issue is.
Brendan, yeah.
Yeah, I think you've raised, an important point that you're right in saying that the global warming is a symptom, of deeper problems. And people talk about it, the climate change is one manifestation of the greater challenge of sustainability, which is about how do we live sustainably within the limits of this planet. And climate change is one of, the kind of most apparent, urgent manifestation of that. But you're right, the root causes of the problem certainly lay elsewhere in our economic system, in our financial systems, and in how we're making use of and the kind of technology that we're drawing upon. So, I would agree with you that there's a broader set of issues that need to be dealt with when we look underneath the climate change problem.
It's a complex issue, isn't it? And thank you for raising it just before we go into our coffee break. One very interesting thing I learned in Copenhagen, so the Danish pension system has partnered with the Kenyan government to fund the largest wind farm in Africa, funded by Danish retirement savings, with a risk-sharing model that is supported by the Danish government and Vestas, their huge wind company. So isn't it ironic that at the same time as we need to move to this collaborative model, somehow the commercial model is actually beginning to actually deliver on scale too. So complex set of issues. Okay, I think we are breaking for coffee. This is the best part, you get to network. And please, let's come back. It's a very short break, so we'll greet you back in about 15 minutes. Thanks.